Welcome to our second episode of Pressing Issues from WDW News Today. My name is Jason Diffendahl, and I'll be your host today while we spend a couple of hours talking about this week's news and discussion on current events going on at the Disney theme parks around the world. I'd like to introduce my panelists for today. First up, we have Ashley Jasmer.
Hello.
We have David Smith.
Hey everyone, good to be here.
And we have Rich Grafton.
Hello everyone.
So, if you tuned into our premiere episode last week, we spent a fair amount of time talking about, obviously, the coronavirus and the shutdown of the Disney parks. We're going to sort of extend that discussion a little bit. What we didn't get to talk about last week was the pay cuts for executives and vice presidents and high-level people within the Walt Disney Company. That was announced right before last week's episode, but we didn't have enough time to talk about it last week. So I thought we'd start with that topic and sort of go from there and talk about the pay cuts, cast member furloughs, and things impacting the company, and then we'll see where the discussion takes us from there. So I know, Ashley, you had a big rant already last week about the executive salary cuts, and we didn't get to that, so why don't you start us off?
So, slightly anticlimactic, I apologize, because I won't lie, I forgot a decent portion of it, but my only thought is this. While I think it's very generous and it's a good gesture that they're doing, what I find suspect and kind of funny is that they're foregoing the base salary and not the stock options and the bonuses and things like that are actually worth far and away more than their base salary. And looking it up just tonight, I mean, Chapek's salary is $2.5 million, but his bonus is $7.5 million. So I still think it's a great gesture, but it seems kind of hollow. If they would have done it in reverse, I think it almost would have seemed more generous, because obviously I'm not saying that they shouldn't get paid something. They do work. They do deserve to earn a living. But I find it comical that in a way, oh yeah, we're giving up our salary, and Iger is giving up his car allowance. I forget what exactly they refer to it as, but his compensation, his car allowance. So I'm guessing he has a company car, and he's giving that back, which is great. Don't get me wrong, steps in the right direction, but comical that they're still going to be receiving far and away. I don't think they're going to miss their salary, is the crux of my story. I also think it's really funny and points more, I think, to Iger always wanting to protect his legacy and his reputation more than anything to seem like a nice guy, because he's giving up his entire salary, whereas Chapek's only giving up half. I don't know who made that decision. I don't know if Chapek made it first and then Iger said, well, I'm just going to give up everything, and it was too late. Like, I want to know how that went down, because that leads into a different thing that we'll probably talk about later, and kind of what we touched on last week, where I think Chapek is being set up horribly to take the fall for basically anything and everything at the tail end of Iger's legacy that Iger doesn't want to take the fall for. But that's kind of the summary of my little rant.
So I think what you said about executives foregoing salary but not the bonus is spot on, at least from my point of view, and from most of what people on the internet have been saying, that, it's a nice gesture, but it really does seem hollow. With everyone else, being laid off, all the hourly cast members being laid off, the executives taking a pay cut while still making, 10 times the salary of an average frontline cast member, or 10 times or more, taking a pay cut of 50% is really, it's almost like a slap in the face to cast members. I mean, first of all, they make, 5% of what the executives make, and then they're getting furloughed on April 19th. The executive make hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're giving away half, but they still have a job. So I think it is just a marketing stunt, basically. That's my perspective. I think that's a perspective of a lot of people on the internet, that they're just doing this to try to look good, but the people that know better can see right through it. And I think that's another problem with a lot of the things the Walt Disney Company has been doing in the past, who knows how many years, 10 years or something, is that they're much more focused on doing what looks good than doing the right thing. And we talked about this a lot last week, and I think this is just another example of that.
So far be it from me to defend the executive leadership of the Walt Disney Company, but I understand the sentiment, and I get that it definitely does look hollow, but I guess I keep coming back to what other options did they really have? Now, I may be wrong, but I don't know if they can necessarily give up performance-based bonus compensation until
they might not be able to legally, and that's why they can't. But
right.
I mean,
but
the
they
other
can
thing,
at least allude to it.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be impacted anyway because it is performance-based, and we know that the performance is not going to be there, so they're probably losing a portion of that anyway.
Yeah, but part of it's performance-based, but I think Chapek's bonus is guaranteed to be 3 times his salary minimum, right? Anything more than that is performance-based, but that's the base level is 3 times his salary. So he's getting that $7.5 million bonus. He's not going to get more than that based on performance, but he's getting at least $7.5 million. So in reality, his total compensation in a year is $10 million, and he's giving back $1.25 million. So it's actually 12% of his total compensation he's giving up.
That's completely fair, but he can't give up what he's not actually getting right now. So if that performance is done annually, then if he gets that bonus at the end of the fiscal year or the beginning of the next fiscal year, there's nothing he can give up right now. Now, what he does with that...
I totally agree.
Year,
Yep. So, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think from a legal perspective, the way the contracts are structured, he's not going to get that bonus until the fiscal year is over, and so he can't give it up. But then that just begs the question of, did they think this through? Did they think that the look of giving up half their salary was going to outweigh the smart people out there that realize that it's really only like 10% of their total compensation? I mean,
right. And
a lot of companies haven't done anything, right? A lot of companies haven't done any moves like this, even though they're furloughing all of their people. Like Landry's basically laid off their entire workforce, but their executives didn't say, "Oh, we're taking a 50% pay cut." So I think it's probably, somebody somewhere thought that the looks of this were going to be better from an optics point of view than the people digging and finding out that Chapek is still making $7.5 million bonus, even though he's technically not getting it until the end of this year or early next year. So in my mind, they could have done nothing, and it almost seems like, and Disney has been doing this quite a lot, is that doing nothing would have caused much less of a fervor on the internet than doing what they did.
Yeah, I pointed out how much they kind of forced us all to look and see what they actually were going to make potentially this year, guaranteed with the salary, which is still a high number, but also with the potential bonus, which is a very high number. And I would suggest that if there was really a will on the part of the board of directors of the Disney Company to use the funding bucket that would have gone to executive bonuses to gift the rank and file with a few more weeks perhaps of earnings, that would have been possible today. But we don't know what those numbers were, but even today, they are planning for what those numbers would be, so they could maybe do something. I don't think it's Iger's call. It's probably not Chapek's call, but it's the board's call. And they're kind of silent, which boards often are, which brings up another interesting point. Why is Iger doing all the talking? He's not the CEO.
Yeah,
He's
that's
chairman
something
of the
we'll
board
get to.
and the other thing. So what's going on there?
I don't want to jump the gun, but I think that's a topic too that we could talk about. But my other thought, and sort of like what you alluded to, Rich, is that, you know, if the executives wanted to get together and say, all right, well, Chapek's given up $1.5 million, Iger's given up all of his salary, which I think is $10 million. If you take a couple of other high-level VPs, you can probably get another several million. What if, like, the executive leadership team of the Walt Disney Company just got together and said, we're going to donate 15 or 20 million dollars to something, whether it's coronavirus relief efforts or the Red Cross or something in Orange County or whatever. Like a donation from the executives of the Walt Disney Company probably would have had much better optics than executives taking a 50% pay cut. And it would have been the same amount of money. It just would have looked a lot better.
Maybe they could have liquidated some of their portfolio.
Yeah. The other thing that I think would have looked better, quite frankly, with everything said and done, is had they actually, I don't know, again, yeah, you could say, okay, we're going to fund everybody for another couple of weeks through these pay cuts. But if they would have actually come together and say, hey, we're putting together a fund to as sort of a safety net for our employees. I think the donation idea is a great idea, but putting something together to say, hey, you know, helping out cast members who reach out and can't pay their rent or can't do this and need, you know, beyond the unemployment and things like that. If cast members need help buying groceries, diapers, again, rent, utilities, those types of things to help our people and make sure that they're taken care of, I think that would have had great optics too and would have actually benefited their cast members, which would have also been a great bonus.
Right. Like, and instead of, even if they couldn't pay them for another 2 weeks beyond April 19th or something, maybe they just give each of them, you know, 50% of their salary for 2 weeks past April 19th. You know, I guess it's kind of
something.
And part of what doesn't get talked about, and I think this is because it has a lot to do with state laws and things like that, is the unemployment situation and whether it's actually better for the cast members to be on unemployment than it is to be getting paid by the Walt Disney Company. And they are extending their benefits. I'm not entirely sure how long they're being extended for, but they're extending their benefits past April 19th. It's just their salary or their hourly pay that's not getting extended. So honestly, it may be the best situation for the cast members to take the unemployment benefits provided by the state, and then they keep the health care coverage from Disney, and maybe they're turning out, you know, pretty much where they would be if they were still working. So it's hard to know unless somebody does a deep analysis of the unemployment situation in Florida. And from what I know, unemployment's not great in Florida, but it does vary by state. And, you know, California may be totally different, but obviously the company can't treat certain cast members better than others based on the state. So
yeah, it's worth pointing out that of the 50 states, Florida is last in the amount of employment benefits per salary earned and so forth in the United States. So it's one of the programs that has been on the back burner from various, like the Orlando Sentinel did a study on it, and et cetera. And it is slow, it's understaffed, it's underfunded, and it isn't the safety net, because the same companies that bring tourists into the state of Florida also have very powerful lobbies that keep the contributions to unemployment very, very low. So it may be that it's better than receiving a pittance from Disney, but based on some of the interviews, it's not really going to help even pay the rent. So it's going to be a very hard situation.
Yeah, I think, and that certainly is the problem when you have a state like Florida that a lot of the income is dominated by a certain industry, and that industry certainly has the ear of the leadership in state government. So, yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
But see, that's why I think something like I was talking about, like establishing a fund to help cast members if they reach out and say, hey, even with the unemployment and everything, I'm short $100, $300 for my rent, and having that fund there that could still help them, because I don't think that would impact their unemployment necessarily, because it would be a gift, not part of salary or
Right.
earned wages or anything like that. But I think that would go a long way to making sure that their cast members are taken care of and showing that they care.
Well, how about this idea? How about a 0% interest loan from the company to cast members that gets repaid over the next year or two out of their salary? So they take, you take 5% of your salary for the next 2 years to repay this loan. Not only does that help the cast members, doesn't interfere with unemployment, but it keeps the cast members around when the parks reopen, because they have to come back to repay that loan. So there's an option that could certainly help cast members. It also makes them, want to come back to work at Disney when the parks reopen. And we talked about this last week, how many cast members are going to want to come back versus how many are just going to go find a different job because they have the opportunity and Disney doesn't really pay very well. That's a way to keep some cast members sort of on board with coming back when the parks reopen, because they're going to have to pay back those loans. But I mean, it's a 0% interest loan from the company. That could be seen as a very helpful alternative too.
It could be, if as long as it was optional. I don't think the Disney company has shown itself in the last 20 years to think that people are going to go elsewhere for work. I think they feel like Disney is the best place to work, and we don't have to make any concessions to our workforce in order to retain them. So I don't think they have that much.
But I think the attrition rate doesn't hold up that argument. I mean, the turnover rate of staff doesn't.
That's part of the training issue that we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, there is all of that, but I will say there is a caveat with that too, and this is way off topic, but there is also a lot of attrition because people walk in thinking, oh, it's Disney, I'm going to give balloons to children and have fun and magical moments. They don't walk in picturing it as an actual job. Like, you saw this a lot, especially with college program kids. Like, the ones that would burn out and self-term or would wind up getting terminated were the people that didn't appreciate the fact that you're still working for a company. It's still a job. It's not in some cases, depending on your job, it's still fun. You're still going to have those magical moments. But if you walk in thinking you're just going to, hand out popcorn to small children and play with Mickey all day, and you get there and realize it's an actual job, you don't last long, whether it's your choice or their choice.
They're not the employees that Disney really wants to keep anyway.
Well, correct. That's what I'm saying. But that also plays into the attrition numbers.
Well, attrition numbers, you can't take college programming into account because they're there for a limited period of time anyway.
Well, no.
But, I think if Disney was the place to work like it was 20 years ago, you'd be seeing a heck of a lot of more of those 10 and 15 and 20-year pins on name tags, and they are super hard to come by nowadays.
Fair. I will give you that.
I think that's certainly, 20 years ago, you used to see a lot of 10s and 15s and 20s name on their name tags, and you don't see them anymore. So, college program or not, the attrition rates are much higher than they used to be, and that sort of not surprisingly dovetails with customer service and people's attitudes at the company, and all this and that we can talk about for months on end. But I think David's right. I think the company isn't known and doesn't have the people in place to come up with plans that, are in the best interest and care about the welfare of their employees.
Yeah.
I mean, we've said it before in other topical discussions, but it's a corporation, it's a public corporation. The primary responsibility, sadly, is to the short-term goals of their stockholders and their stakeholders, not the rank and file, not even us, the customers, but to maximize the dividend and the stock returns. And like many other corporations, the short-term focus has certain consequences, one of which is attrition and turnover and the general deprecation of the worth of the people who generate the income for you. Like I said last week, at a certain size, any corporation becomes a bank. And the fact that they do something to earn money to fund the bank is almost incidental. Certainly Disney is a demonstration of that, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's at least one of the things that sets apart the Walt Disney Company from the Orlando Land Company that owns Tokyo Disneyland Resort. I don't believe Orlando Land Company is a public company, so they don't have stockholders to. They don't have stockholders to worry about dividends and complaining about share prices and things like that. They can do what's in the best long-term interest of the company, which happens to be in the interest of the customer too. But the Walt Disney Company did that. The Walt Disney Company did that from its inception until probably the mid to late 90s.
Until the Eisner years.
No, Eisner did it. Eisner did it until actually
at the beginning, until Wells passed.
The turning point in the Walt Disney Company, and I've been saying this for years and years. I've been saying this for like 15 years now, and I think it just is panning out, and it's more and more evident as time goes on. The turning point in the Walt Disney Company was the death of Frank Wells. Eisner was a great CEO at the beginning, and it wasn't until Frank Wells died that Eisner kind of went a little crazy and went off the deep end in some instances, to the point that he was almost getting kicked out in 2004.
Yeah, he made bad decisions,
but
because there wasn't anybody to check him. Frank Wells was that person that could keep him in check. So he made bad decisions, and no one told him they were bad. Yes, and I think there was no one on an equal footing like Wells was.
Mm-hmm. There was no one that Eisner would listen to like he listened to Frank Wells to tell him this is a bad decision. And so those bad decisions got made and put into place, and then things went downhill from there.
And I think the other talent that Frank Wells had that I think is not recognized as much is that he was also able to talk to the shareholders and calm them down so that they weren't panicking when they had different results than they were expecting. So I think, his death not only was a check on Eisner, it was also a check on the majority shareholders. Yeah. So when you lose that, now you have shareholders running things and making decisions based on quarter to quarter numbers, rather than having to explain the long-term impact.
Exactly. There's not somebody there telling or, helping them see the bigger picture, the bigger impact. They're just looking at it from this quarter to next quarter.
And I also think you have different shareholders nowadays than you did in the 80s and 90s. Like you had shareholders back then that were interested in the long-term.
Yeah, also true.
The long-term interest of the company and not making a quick buck and buying the stock and then getting out in 3 months and taking their profit and going home. So you had it was a very different financial world than it is now, which is unfortunate for most companies that are public companies, and that's all the banking and investing segments of the industry that are driving all that. It's not the individual shareholders. All right. Any other discussions about executives and senior management before we get on with the furloughed cast members and then the union negotiations that led to the union cast members being furloughed as well?
Nope. Nothing left.
All right. So it was announced several weeks ago that Disney was going to announce, or that Disney announced that hourly and non-union cast members were going to be furloughed as of April 19th. So they would get paid their regular salary through April 19th. And then after April 19th, they would maintain their health care, but not get a salary after that point. And so that was announced for hourly and salaried and other non-union cast members, but obviously the union cast members, of which there are quite a lot in both Florida and California, they couldn't be furloughed until the negotiations with the union led to an agreement for the union cast members. And so it took a week or two, I think, for things to work out in these negotiations, because obviously there's a bunch of different unions that represent different cast members in different areas of the company. But there's 40,000 union cast members that work at the Disney parks. And eventually the company got to an agreement with the unions that the union cast members would be furloughed also on the same date, April 19th. And so that now covers pretty much every cast member that's not an executive, except for essential maintenance and security staff, who are obviously still required to be there, and animal care staff at Animal Kingdom and things like that. But for the vast majority of cast members, union and non-union now, they are all getting furloughed as of April 19th. And so, to me, it took a little while for the company to negotiate with the union about this furlough, because they had to, because of the union contracts. But it wasn't a surprise to me that the outcome was the same. I think in light of this extended closure and the closure going on longer, I think, than the company and many of us sort of expected, I don't think the union had really any leverage to argue that the union cast members deserve to be paid and kept on salary longer than the non-union cast members. I think Disney's argument was that April 19th was a pretty generous date to keep paying people, and they still maintained their health care after that. And so the union, I don't think, had a leg to stand on in terms of arguing for anything beyond April 19th. Now, that's just my opinion, but I'd like to hear what you all have to say.
I would agree with that. And there's also the optics of, arguing that your people deserve to get paid over the non-union cast members. When you're going out trying to recruit, that could smack you in the face just as much as it benefits you next go around once the parks do open. And overall, I think the unions do care a little bit about their optics, because especially you take a union like the Teamsters, and they don't just represent cast members at Disney, they represent people from all stretches of all walks of life. And if it gets out that they're being, mean or nasty or unfair during this global pandemic and get bad PR, that could have smacked them just as much as it helps them, saying, oh, well, we negotiate hard for our people. So I agree. I don't think they really had the typical bargaining chips that a union would have in this case. You can't walk out and go on strike. You can't do any of those things. The parks are already closed. So I think they had to negotiate because, like you said, the contracts, but ultimately I'm not surprised either. I could have seen maybe an additional week, but that would have been a stretch. And like I said, I think the optics and the PR of that could have hurt them just as much as it helped them.
Yeah, they were definitely, I think, caught between a rock and a hard place for the reasons that Ashley just mentioned. And in general, the union, like Disney, wants to ensure primarily the continued existence of the union. And this was the best way to do that. This shows that they did what they could for their membership. They retained seniority, they retained pensions, they retained they called them signature benefits, I think, during the shutdown. But I mean, if they were not able to negotiate, then they'd probably have to go to arbitration, and that would have been probably much worse, because I would imagine it would come down on the side of the corporation and not as much of the unions. It will be interesting, speaking of executives of the Disney company taking pay cuts and so on, to see what the union is able to do or is willing to do for their Disney membership, whether they have the funds similar to the UAW set up for helping their membership along during the times when they're furloughed, and to see if there's any potential benefit for that. Again, like Ashley just said, that would be something favorable that people would look on the unions, which might be a little different these days when they don't get much favorable press. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Do we know if they've suspended dues for the union during this period?
We haven't heard anything saying that they have. So I don't know.
I know in other arrangements, the dues were directly tied to your paycheck. So the idea being that the union would guarantee that you get a paycheck, therefore they would guarantee they would get income. If the union essentially broke that guarantee, so to speak, then they no longer were entitled to take their cut. But I'm sure every contract is different, but in my experience, that's the way it used to be anyway.
I think for the most part, that's the way things are. Yeah.
That makes sense. I think I agree with everything that's been said. I don't think there was a whole lot of negotiating room here. There wasn't a lot of leverage that the union had. I think, whether you like them or not, I think they did the right thing in trying to extend the conversation just a little bit to see what was possible. If they want to take the victory lap on getting the benefits extended, go for it. I don't know. The company was probably going to offer that anyway, but regardless, they're sort of doing what they're supposed to do in this case. So, I don't hold them to account for taking a little bit longer than the non-union agreement, but it ended up being the same. So I think that worked out the right way.
Yeah, it's always more difficult, not more difficult, more people in the process. When you think about it, the direct hires had just one contract to deal with, whereas the union people had two, the contract that the collective bargaining unit, as the union has with Disney, and then the contract the collective bargaining unit had with the membership. Back in the day, the union members would say that they work for the union, and the union contracts work with the company. So that it was much more complicated, I'm sure, because you had much more wheels in motion than simply, here's your employment contract that we're now engaging a furlough clause or what have you. So, yeah, I would agree. I don't fault them at all for taking longer. I just think it's that much more complicated.
So if you look at the union memorandum with the company, it spells out in detail how the furlough works. It talks about the maintenance of the healthcare. Healthcare will be maintained for 12 months. So I hope the closure certainly doesn't last 12 months, and I don't think anyone thinks it'll really last 12 months. But that's part of the union contract, is that the health care will continue for 12 months. It also has provisions in there for accrued vacation time to get paid and things like that, which all makes kind of sense. But there's also a paragraph in there, and I'm going to read this because it's really interesting. It says, Florida's unemployment system is broken. Workers have tried for weeks to apply and receive money. Despite Governor DeSantis' promise to fix the system, the online application is terrible. Checks are not arriving. Workers cannot wait to feed their families. We need Florida's benefit, which is only $275 per week. And even more importantly, we need the $600 weekly benefit passed by the U.S. government. So Florida's unemployment is $275 per week, which is fairly paltry. Yeah. Hence, Rich's assertion that Florida ranks 50th out of the 50 states in unemployment benefits. That certainly sounds pretty poor. The $600 weekly benefit passed by the U.S. government is certainly going to make that much better, but I think that feeds through the state's unemployment. So the problem is, if the state's unemployment system is as broken as they're saying, it's going to take weeks for them to get the $600 from the U.S. government as well. But that's what this publication states, and so it's very interesting to see that even the union is complaining about Florida's unemployment system. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, it is. From our friends and family in Florida, it's almost an incentive to not work in Florida. It's so bad. If it weren't for the climate and the beaches, nobody would probably work in Florida. But it's historically, they've been riding the wave of probably 2 or 3 decades now, since the 2008, so a decade and a half. And so you don't fund those things that people don't like to talk about, like unemployment. And then suddenly when you need it, ta-da, it has no money, it has no staff, it has no back-end computer systems to handle thousands of applications every minute. It's bad.
Somebody in the chat says Arizona is $240 a week for unemployment.
Wow.
And in Connecticut, unemployment takes 5 to 6 weeks to be approved to get any payments. So Florida may be last, but it looks like it has a fair amount of company down there at the bottom.
It's not great anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in our nanny state of Massachusetts, it's better, but we pay in other ways.
Somebody mentioned here, and this is sort of a tangent, but we can talk about it if you want. This also kind of leads into our next topic, though. So I think unless anybody has anything else they want to talk about union-wise or anything, I think we'll move to our next topic.
No.
So the next topic was talking about the $7.3 billion in debt issued by the Walt Disney Company, and they're lobbying for a portion of the government's CARES Act money to support businesses. What I think this really underlies, and somebody in the chat said this, was the horrendous timing of the Fox acquisition. The Fox acquisition was very expensive. It was generally unnecessary. And I think it put the company in a much more precarious position in terms of cash on hand and debt, that going into this now shutdown due to coronavirus is much riskier now for the long-term health of the company than it would have been if it happened before the Fox acquisition.
True, but devil's advocate, nobody could have seen an international pandemic striking when it did.
Oh, I don't disagree.
So
I don't
while
disagree
the Fox Act was, it's obviously awful timing, but was it necessary? No, but when you consider like the benefits to Marvel and things like that, it did kind of make sense. I think they overpaid by a little bit. I think they promised things that they're not now going to be able to deliver, as far as, and they haven't followed through on as far as succession goes in the company. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, I don't know. I don't blame them for it, though. That's one thing that I think, looking at it on paper at the time that it was presented to them as an option, it made sense to pull the trigger. And again, they had so many great things on the horizon. They said, oh, we'll make the money back up in no time. No big deal. And now a pandemic has happened. And like everything else, it's crap. What do we do now? And who knows? Maybe it'll be a good thing. Maybe it will humble them in the future as far as big acquisitions and things like that. Planning for the future a little bit better than what they have in the past.
Yeah. That's very true. I mean, yeah, certainly you can't fault Disney for not realizing that a pandemic was coming and spending all that money on Fox. And somebody in the chat also said that if Disney hadn't bought Fox, somebody else would have. So it's just the natural consolidation in the media industry. And maybe it'll turn out in the long run that it was to Disney's advantage in the long run that they have the Fox assets now. It's just that it's going to take them a lot longer to pay off all of that debt than they had originally proposed. And so, I mean, when companies look at big deals like this and they look at ROI, they have to focus on income and how long it will take them to make back the amount of money that they spent. And so if that calculation ends up being 5 years, well, that's clearly a lot better than if it was like 15 years. If the calculation was 15 years to make back the money, that may be enough of a reason not to do the deal. And so now the calculation is all totally, any of their calculations are off way off now because of this coronavirus closure. And so who knows how long it's going to take them to make the money back. But I think...
Yeah, I think the technical term is wonky as far as the financial calculations go there. But and not only do they have the debt of the acquisition because they paid cash and stock, if I remember correctly, but they also, of course, bought them so that they could generate additional income to feed the coffers of the Disney company, and that's not happening either. So it's kind of a double whammy for them. Yes, agree.
Yeah.
Couldn't see the future. Seemed like a good deal at the time. But now what do you do with this additional anchor on you, essentially, with all the debt that must be associated with that and all the overhead that's now doing nothing, no income whatsoever?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly can't fault them, and I don't think anybody here is trying to. I think that my concern is, when a company becomes weighed down by this type of debt and it becomes unsustainable, your options are very few. Have somebody, basically sell yourself to somebody, get acquired, or you figure out a way to drive revenue up, which there's not a whole lot they can do more because they've already been driving revenue for the last 6 years, or you cut costs. And I think that is going to be their initial reaction between, and we're going to talk about this, between raising prices and cutting costs. They're going to try to make up some of that difference. And I don't think it's going to do much for the experience.
With Chapek in charge, that's the only thing they seem to know how to do. So, for sure.
Circling back a little bit, because we haven't touched on this part. We talked about Fox and everything, but do we know, and I may have read it somewhere and completely forgotten, how much they're lobbying for of the CARES Act money? Did they offer anything as far as how much they're looking to get? Their justification for asking for it? Or do we think it's all just tied to the debt for the Fox?
Their justification for asking is that, essentially the entire company shut down. But I don't know of a number. I don't know that any company has, asked for a number. They just say, we need some. Somebody in the chat says $6 billion. Obviously,
and of course, until Congress acts and the president acts, there won't be much money in that fund anyway. So it might be a moot point until the legislature gets their act together. But I mean,
absolutely.
Isn't there's some sort of a formula, if I remember correctly, in the original act that determines how much a company is eligible for, but then it's somewhat discretionary to actually get a portion up to 100% of what you're eligible for. I don't remember the details. I just skimmed through it, but it's not simple by any means, of course. But I mean, it's on the one hand, Disney is not an essential service. Like one could argue an airline might be an essential service that you don't want to disappear. But on the other hand, as we always hear, they are the single site employer in the United States. So that does have a huge impact on that state's economy. So that may give them a leg up in whatever portion of the CARES they're able to obtain.
Essential but non-essential.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, important but not essential. I mean, the other thing is that a lot of companies that have had to shut down stop paying employees, but they don't have necessarily the huge amount of overhead that Disney does. So, there's that aspect of things as well, that, Disney has a lot more costs to keep things, maintained and stuff like that, as opposed to just like, a Best Buy that's closed and they just reopen the door in a month and everything's still there kind of thing. So there's arguments to be made one way or the other. But, airlines are one thing. Cruise lines are also, in the same straits, and hotel chains are too. But one could certainly make the argument, well, I think Trump has said, he's not going to give the cruise lines any money because none of them are based in America, and so they don't pay U.S. taxes on any of their profits. But there's plenty of other industries, like the hotels, that are, really hurting from the coronavirus, and they have a lot of overhead. They have property to maintain and things like that. So, I mean, there's this argument can be made for a huge number of industries. And so I think the question is, well, how much money is there and how much should each company get? And that really is probably just going to come down to, lobbying efforts and how much Congress likes you and is willing to give you money, which is politics as usual for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, in the relief package, there's $500 billion that's set aside for stabilization. Of that, they take some for airlines and cargo airlines. There's national security critical companies that get $17 billion, which leaves about $450 billion to subsidize cities, states, or other businesses that don't have other means of relief. Now, what's interesting is that Disney is doing this lobby not just by themselves, but they've partnered with the U.S. Travel Association, which represents, like you just said, Jason, hotels and even cruise lines and all those other travel adjacent businesses. So they're trying to lobby as a single unified organization to get some of that relief into the travel industry. But how much of that would go to the Walt Disney Company is, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, we are a quote unquote service economy. So in order to have a service economy, you need people and entities to be serviced. And if you can't maintain some level of involvement, then your service goes away, which means that the people going on vacation go away, which means that more service goes away, and it's kind of a downward spiral from there. So it would be important, I think, to try to get some portion of the travel businesses stabilized, but again, how long are they going to have to be stabilized for? How much it'll cost? What a stabilized look like? Nobody knows the answers to those questions yet.
Well, and I think, one of the other things is that people who've had vacations planned and have had them canceled, obviously if those people are still employed when the parks open back up, they're going to still be interested in going on vacation. I know for me, like I had a trip planned to Florida and then a trip planned to Japan, and both of those got canceled, and I have a trip booked for May 5th to go back to Florida, and who knows whether that's going to happen, probably not. But I'm sort of chomping at the bit to get back to the Disney parks. And I don't know how many people out there are like me that are still, employed and didn't lose their job and still interested in going back to the Disney parks. But then we get a $3,400 or $2,400 government stimulus check per couple. On top of that, for people that don't actually need that money, that's sort of disposable income for them that could pay for, another trip to Disney World or something like that. So my question is, at the end of all this, sure, it's going to take some time for things to stabilize, but, is there going to be a lot of pent-up demand for Disney vacations because of all the peoples that got canceled? I mean, obviously, Disney's letting them, rebook at a later date this year or whatever without penalty or something. So I think once things are relatively safe to go back out in public, whenever that is and however that happens to come, and, we could talk about that, but that's way on a tangent. But I think once, this pandemic ends and life is as back to normal as it can be for now, my thought is that, people are going to want to travel. And they're going to want to make up for these missed vacations. I mean, in my company, people were asking our leadership last week, I get 4 weeks of vacation a year, and I had planned to take 2 or 3 of them, and those 2 or 3 weeks of vacation got canceled. Now what am I going to do? And that could actually impact the company if, 50,000 people are all taking 3 weeks of vacation compressed into a 6-month period of time as opposed to across 12 months. But, we still get vacation days. And I realize that there are a lot of people in this country that are unemployed now. People analysts are saying up to 25% or 30% unemployment rate. But certainly once things start to open back up, that unemployment rate is going to drop quite a bit. And a lot of these people are going to go back to work. So these furloughs or layoffs are temporarily. Only going to be temporary, and the unemployment rate isn't going to stay at 30% like during the Great Recession or whatever. So if these people won't have the money to travel, but there are some people that will, and there are, I think there's going to be pent-up demand. I think there's going to be, for certain things like Disney World, I think there's going to be pent-up demand. Maybe not for cruises as much. I think this is going to impact the cruise industry a heck of a lot more than, theme park industry and hotels and things like that. But there's going to be all kinds of, business travel that needs to take place that's going to count for hotels and things like that. So, I think depending on how safe it is to go out in the world and go back to Walt Disney World, I think that things are going to transition back to what I would say is like sort of a steady state, full capacity. One analyst I think said it could take 2 years to get back to normal. My thought is that, if there's a vaccine by the year's end, then Disney's going to be back to normal by Christmas. And I think all those people that had, Christmas travel plans to Disney World, my guess would be that this Christmas week is going to be just as crowded as last year was. And when it takes, whether it takes another 2 months or 3 months or however long to get back to normal, I think all the people that had trips planned for, Christmas this year are still going to go. I think some are going to cancel. Obviously, the people that have lost their jobs and haven't been reemployed are going to certainly cancel. But there's probably plenty of people to take up those spots based on how hard it is to get reservations around Christmas time at Walt Disney World. Cruises are not allowed to sail for another 100 days by order of the CDC, and that order came down just a couple days ago. So 100 days is...
I think it was sometime in June.
Go ahead, Ashley.
End of June. Something. Oh, I was just agreeing with you about the cruise line thing. That I think it's somewhere at the end of June for the 100 days before they can sail again.
If you read the CDC order, it says the no sail order is extended for 100 days. So in my mind, extended for 100 days means 100 days from when that order came down, not 100 days from the first no sail order back in March. So 100 days from really today is sort of the end of July. It's like July 21st. So, but it depends. So, okay. So somebody in the chat is saying the cruise line clock starts on April 15th when it was published to the Federal Register. So that's certainly late July till the cruise lines can sail again. And that's if things don't get extended again, obviously. But late July is, I think, way beyond when the Disney company had hoped to reopen their parks. I mean, they're taking reservations now for June 1st. So that's, another almost 7-8 weeks that the cruise lines are going to be impacted, even after the parks could open up. But as somebody else in the chat said, a cruise ship is basically a petri dish for viruses and other kinds of things to
one of the most efficient ways to spread a disease.
Exactly, bingo.
Yeah.
And so I mean, we even have our WDWNT cruise. We were planning a cruise for August 17th. That may end up being right after cruises are allowed to sail again. And I think people who have cruises scheduled in, August and September are certainly going to think twice about it. And I know a lot of the people that are scheduled to cruise with us in August are thinking twice about it. And, we're talking to Disney Cruise Line about our options there. But I think what... I've just been talking for a while, and I don't know where I was going, so why don't I turn it over to somebody else? If anybody else wants to touch on any of the points that I've just made, I've been rambling on for a while.
I do.
We could take
first of all, temporary. We don't really know what that means yet. I mean, the Cambrian period was temporary, and that lasted 50 million years. So we don't really know how long this will be. I mean, if we
Mickey's birthday land was temporary.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of long geological periods of time. But I mean, we don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know how long it'll take to actually have a vaccine. If we had a vaccine within 12 months, I would be extremely surprised given the history of what it takes to actually build, test, deploy, and manufacture a vaccine. Not just an antibody test or anything like that, but an actual probably simulated or actual killed virus vaccine. That is an extraordinarily hard task. If we need to do an Apollo program level of activity to make it, and it would happen within a year. But that's tough.
I think we are.
That's tough. Yeah,
I think many
if we did that, then
Yep.
that would be. A year is still a year from now. Until then, do we still have to do social distancing at Disney? Would that cause them to cut in half the amount of people that are allowed on property at one time? The longer the economy is shut down, because we have an economy that is built on people spending money, and if they're not able to spend money because it's locked at home, or even worse, because they don't have any money, then the longer it will take, I think, to rebuild and restart and get things going again. So I'm not sure that Disney in particular, which is a non-necessity if there ever was one, would ramp up as quickly as all that. I mean, for us who are so very fortunate to maintain employment during this period, we've had a couple of trips canceled, which we're very disappointed about, but that's as far as it goes. We're kind of waiting to see what, might happen after August or something like that. Might things have at least been organized sufficiently so that we can get on an airplane without having to get to the airport 5 hours in advance, for example. We don't know what that's going to look like. So I think people will start going back to the state parks, back to Disney, back to museums, but it's going to be a rolling process. If it starts, let's say in July, maybe there's 1% in July, and then 10, and then 20, and then 50, something like that. So that at Christmas, we have 50% capacity at Walt Disney World, partly because that's the number of people that are able to go, and partly maybe because that's the limit of how many people are allowed, I'll use air quotes, on property at that point. We don't know. It's fun to speculate.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We don't know.
I didn't mention that. We could certainly talk about... I'll let you go in a second, actually. But that's a point that I didn't mention, was reduced capacity. And somebody in the chat mentioned about cruise ships and whether there's going to be reduced capacity on cruise ships. And, certainly reduced capacity at Walt Disney World is something feasible. It's called, the off-season, back in the, decades ago when there was an off-season.
Back in the day.
Yeah, but certainly, in the early 2000s after 9/11, it was an off-season year-round. There were very limited crowds. So a limited attendance at the Disney parks makes sense. I don't think it makes sense on cruise ships. I don't think it's really feasible to run a cruise ship with the expense of a cruise ship with it being half full. And that's why cruise ships do everything they possibly can to sail full. Yeah, very different.
Other things like trade shows and other things like that that require close quarters, I mean, those won't happen either. So, there will be sectors, I only bring that up because it was in the news recently, there will be sectors of the economy that will not start for many months after we get called back to work, and probably have to wait until we get an actual vaccine, and then have to wait until it gets distributed and administered. So some sectors of the economy they're a long way out, I'm afraid.
Well, I mean, if you talk about essential business things, I don't think trade shows are really essential business things either. So,
no, but they generate economy money, though. That's the thing.
Sure they do. They do.
You just use that as an example of a non-essential thing that builds money and stuff. That's all.
Right. No, true. And somebody else in the chat said, this sounds sort of like where Donald Trump is going with things. How long can the country afford to be closed? Certainly every day that the country is essentially closed is another hit to the economy and will take longer to recover from. But I also think that absent a solution to coronavirus, you can't reopen the country. And like Rich said, doing it in stages, whether the stages mean by industry or by region where there's, very little coronavirus contagion going on. I think there's ways to do that. And we could talk, if you want to talk, we can talk extensively about what it's going to take for, Disney to reopen things, whether it's a vaccine, whether it's, countrywide testing of every citizen in America, or whether it's just a drug that will treat coronavirus well. There's a lot of different things, but, certainly if we get back to the point where things open slowly and there's, reduced attendance caps, how that's going to work at a Walt Disney Park, whether, you have to be an on-site resort guest to get into the parks or whatever. And then, also, you talked about, temperature checks at the entrance to the park. So you got a bag check, a ticket check, and then a temperature check. That kind of thing makes a lot of sense to me, although with the number of asymptomatic people that are spreading coronavirus, I don't think it matters too much. But then the question is, that's not something that's been in the American mindset ever. It happens in other countries quite a bit. But how are Americans going to take to having their temperature checked when they enter venues? I mean, is that protected health information under the HIPAA Act? I don't know. That's where things get a little crazy.
Here's the thing.
Go ahead.
I'm
done rambling again.
I think people will adjust to that the same way they adjusted to having to go through the metal detectors at Disney. If there's a demonstrated necessity for it, because again, at least here in America, and I think even in Disneyland Paris when it happened, there was a demonstrated need for metal detectors. I mean, not that we had any incidents happen, but there were a couple of near misses. There was the gentleman that, God bless him, allegedly forgot that he was concealed carrying and his gun fell out of his, waistband or whatever on dinosaurs. So there was a demonstrated need for them. I think people would adjust to the temperature check. Although to your point with asymptomatic people, I don't know how much it would help. There was another question in the chat about how they would limit people. That would probably be pretty easy. It would be the same as like Christmas and New Year's, where they would just reduce the capacity. And when they have that X amount of people check in, they would just say, oh, I'm sorry, we're not letting anybody in right now, and, come back in a couple hours or what have you, like they do. I mean, they hit capacity now at Christmas.
If those capacity shutdowns, those capacity shutdowns that happen at Christmas and New Year's, if they start happening on a random Tuesday in July, that's going to get to be a bit crazy.
No, I think it'll still be crazy, but at the same token, I think Disney would be a little bit more transparent with those numbers and expectations if that was the case. Christmas and New Year's, they're not fully transparent. You still see, God bless them, people that don't appreciate the fact that Magic Kingdom is going to be full of people by 10 a.m. on Christmas Day and get upset when they can't get in. But I think, let me put it this way. I would hope that Disney, Iger, or whoever their spokesperson is going to be, would communicate that out as part of the reopening procedure. Like, hey, we're going to have to reduce the number of people that we let into the park to allow for social distancing. Please plan accordingly, what have you. So there's that. But I'm of two minds when it comes to Disney. As somebody who is still blessed, at least currently, to still be employed. On the one hand, I would want to go. On the other hand, I think it would be irresponsible. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens when the park reopens. And I don't want to get too deep into it because I know that I think this is planned for like a full deep dive on a different episode. But yeah, I think I won't be surprised to see any of that. If they do the temperature checks, whether it's at Disney or the airports or anywhere else, I think people will adjust to it the same way they did to metal detectors and the scanners at the airport and everything like that, that people always say, oh, nobody will go for that. They're, you know, people get mad and then they wind up knuckling under and doing it because they want to do whatever the thing that is required of them to go through that is for. So.
Right. And so I think maybe the argument there is that if you have to go through a metal detector, that doesn't mean you're getting kicked off the airplane. But if you go to Walt Disney World and spend $4,000 for a vacation in Walt Disney World and then get sick and you can't go in the parks for any of that time, that's a huge expense that you're not going to be able to recoup. I mean, you can't go complain and say, you know, I came here and I can't go in the parks. Obviously, maybe they'll refund your tickets, but certainly not the hotels or anything else. So that's potentially a problem that, you know, is different than airlines or whatever.
But here's the other thing also. If they're publicizing that, hey, we're checking your temperature, and I think that also, and people should, it would behoove them to do this, is travel insurance. But if they're publicizing the fact that, hey, we're going to take your temperature when you roll up to the park, if I know that I'm getting sick or coming down with something, I don't know that I'm going to necessarily still go then. And I'm probably, you know, in a new day and age, I'm not one that usually books travel insurance now, but I would probably book it in the future. And I would make sure that it covered if I get sick, and I won't be surprised if Disney starts offering something like that for an additional fee. I think they do offer travel insurance now if you book through them. And I would hope that it would include that, like, hey, if I get sick and I can't go, then I can get my money back or, you know, rebook at a later date. I think you can get your money back.
Like, right. But if you cancel your trip, you get your money back. But does travel insurance cover you go and you get sick at Disney World and half your vacation is spent in, you know, you with a fever in your hotel room? Does travel insurance cover that? I mean, that's a very
I don't think it covers it now, but I would be curious
scenario.
to see if it does in the future. If that becomes
it very
a thing.
well might be something that they're going to have to add. Yeah, for sure.
But it doesn't cover it now. And I'm trying to wrap my head around. Those people should be staying home I mean, they should be staying in their hotel room anyway. I mean, it's not uncommon.
Oh, they
That's
should.
also true. That is also very true.
But how many of them say...
Yeah, but if we're checking temperatures, now that's a disincentive for them to actually try to get in. And isn't that kind of what we want? I don't think the actual efficacy of the temperature checks is not necessarily the temperature check itself. It's stopping people from making that step through the gate that should have stayed in the hotel.
Right. Absolutely. But people are going to argue that I spent $4,000 for this vacation and damn it, I'm going to the parks whether my temperature's 80 or 100. That is... Well, that's... what people are going to say. Like I spent thousands of dollars for this trip. It's my God-given right to get into the parks no matter what my temperature is. That's the argument that these people are going to have. I'm not saying they should let them in. I'm all for temperature checks. I mean, heck, I'm for temperature checks and x-ray machines. I wish Disney would install x-ray machines instead of their stupid bag checks. But the question is... you know, what are these people going to do when they're turned away? And then also, is this temperature check actually going to do anything to prevent the spread of coronavirus? I mean, it could certainly keep sick people out of the parks, but if those people are sick with things other than coronavirus and they have coronavirus and they're shedding the virus, but they're asymptomatic, then you're going to keep sick people out of the parks, but it's not going to do anything for coronavirus. So I think that's... You know, is the temperature check going to be another thing that looks good from a public relations point of view, like the bag checks, but it doesn't actually necessarily do much to address the problem?
So it's like the executive pay cut all over again. It has nice optics
Bingo.
as long as you don't look too closely at it. It's, kind of like
it's really like what the Walt Disney Company does most of the time.
Yes, it is. And you could argue, I mean, we have that today in post 9/11 with TSA. How effective is all of the checks that we go through today, considering how often the GSA says they fail and all that sort of thing. But I definitely, temperature does not seem to be the determining criteria for somebody who has COVID-19. But what is? You have to swab them and have them take a test. The logistics of that are impossible in that situation unless there's a 5-minute test that we develop or something.
Well,
I think there will be at some point, but
sure. Devil's advocate, though, I will say Iger, when he made that statement about temperature checks, was clear that they were watching how it was being done, because I think, is it Tokyo, not Disney Tokyo, but other places in Tokyo, Japan are trying to do temperature China. Okay, I wasn't sure. But they're trying to do it, and they're watching closely how effective it is over there. So it may be just, I mean, I feel it could happen, but at the same token, they didn't say it as a certainty. And they are saying that they're watching closely how well it's working currently. So, I mean, there is kind of already a testing ground. If it doesn't work there, I doubt they're going to actually implement it here, because people are already going to know that it doesn't work. So I think it's just a waiting game to see what happens.
Well, I mean, one of the things that is being talked about in Europe is a health pass, where you're tested, and if you're negative for coronavirus, then you get a pass that says you're allowed to travel. And then you can get on an airplane or go to a theme park or whatever. But until you get tested and have that health pass, you're not allowed. That certainly sounds like it will be more effective than a temperature check at the front gates of the parks. And that's actively being talked about in Europe. So
I don't know. I still think that's a point in time thing, though.
Yeah, because what happens? Okay, so so if I get tested and I'm clear, and I get on a plane with an asymptomatic person who's not showing symptoms or anything, and may or may not test positive just yet, or I come into contact with somebody who's sick in a particular city and snuck out of quarantine, and then I travel more, to David's point, that would almost have to be a daily test if I'm traveling.
Right. A single test on a person is not gonna do it. You either have to test everyone in the country on the same day, or else you have to have ongoing repetitive tests to be able to keep the people that have the virus quarantined.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as we're gonna speculate, maybe to the point that I think Jason, you made earlier, part of the limitation of who gets to go into Magic Kingdom and the other parks, you are either in a Disney property hotel or maybe a Good Neighbor hotel or what have you, and before you are allowed in the hotel, you go to the concierge, who is now the minute clinic at the check-in desk. You get a test, and then before you're allowed to go to your room, you have to pass that test, and that test is what gets you through the next 3 days, and you're able to enter
your travel stamp,
enter the resort, right, or something like that. And if you stay for 10 days, you get to take 3 tests during that 10 days. I mean, that's a little extreme, probably logistically. I don't know how that would work, but
it would work
with what with what we know today. That's almost the only definitive criteria that you could use to say, yes, you are not a risk to the rest of the human beings in the park.
Yep, absent a vaccine or a drug or something, that is absolutely true.
Right.
Somebody in the chat says, do you guys realize how insane this sounds?
Oh, absolutely.
I think we do realize it sounds insane.
But it's
that's
fun.
part of what the show is about. It's also fun, but it's also, I think, maybe it does sound insane. Maybe in 6 months we'll show how dumb this all was, or maybe in 6 months we'll be shown how prescient we were, that this is actually happening now. So who knows? I have no idea.
You could make the argument that you need insanity you need insanity for those times during which the world has gone insane. It's the only solution. And that's
kind of where we are.
I just want to go back and make two quick points. The first one, back to the comment you said earlier about the American economy, not being able to survive too much longer this mode. I don't disagree with that, but I think what would be even worse for the American economy is to throw open the doors, have a rebound outbreak, and then we have to go through 6 to 8 weeks more. I'd rather take a month now and open carefully
Agreed.
than open everything up and have to redo this. The other thing about the parks is, and this has been mentioned several times, but I'm not sure that even if you cut your capacity, let's say in half, I'm not sure that having social distancing in the park really does that much, because there are just so many common touch points within the park.
Yeah.
That staying 6 feet away from somebody is not helping if you're touching the lap bar of the 6 people after you. So reduce the opening may be something they try, but I don't know. I'm not sure it's going to be
as long as we're talking insanity. I mean, maybe the ride capacities are cut to 1/3 because after every single group you have to sterilize the ride vehicle. I mean,
could be
that could be. First of all, we need to get rid of the touch points. I think we could all agree at the touch styles to get rid of those. But who knows?
Makes you wonder what they'll do about your fingerprint now.
Yeah, we'll start seeing Mickey ponchos expanded into Mickey hazmat suits.
They were disinfecting those every time right before they closed. The fingerprint scanners.
That's true.
Yeah, the fingerprint scanners. Yeah.
Hopefully, things like the stupid fingerprint scanners that do nothing but slow down the lines now are being seen as a virus transmission vector will be gotten rid of, and they'll just finally go to photos so that they could match the photo that's embedded in your pass with you standing there and not have to deal with a stupid touch scanner. Sure.
And then we add in the recognition technology that's starting to be used at the airports, and you just walk right through the turnstile. You don't have to stop.
Right. Sure. I mean, people are going crazy about facial recognition, invasion of privacy, but imagine how much easier it makes our lives, right? Like, people complain how those fingerprint scanners slow down the lines. Well, hey, there's a way to fix it, and it will make the lines much faster, but you got to use facial recognition. Are people willing to do that? I mean, I would. I know Disney knows what I look like. Hey, I'm on YouTube every week. Of course Disney knows what I look like. So the fact that they're going to scan my face when I enter a park, I don't care. But some people care. David, was that both of the things you wanted to say, or was that just one?
Was it. Nope, I'm all set.
Okay. Go ahead, Ashley.
No, I was just going to say, I think facial recognition software as far as scanning might be a bit much, but I could definitely get on board with the picture thing. I mean, Six Flags does your picture, for crying out loud. I don't know. I think that would just be a touch too far for most people. To your point, I wouldn't mind. I don't care. I know Disney knows what I looks like. I have enough PhotoPass photos and YouTube and all of that. I've now several times have been on WDWNT events, may or may not have been accosted by security a couple of times. So I know they know what I look like. But I think that might be a touch too far for most people. But a photo, nobody blinks twice here in Atlanta when Six Flags takes your picture and prints it on the back of your pass.
Right.
Like,
Disneyland used to
pictures
do it.
would be just
Disneyland
fine.
used to print it on your pass. They don't print it on your pass anymore, but they still have your ppicture in the system when you get an annual pass. People in the chat are having a great time with this. That that Disney knows what Tom looks like, and that if I went in the parks with facial recognition, it would come up on the system. This one works with Tom Corliss.
It may or may not do that already.
But then people are also saying, well, yeah, they could use that technology to make sure the people that are banned from the parks don't get in. But it's kind of like the technology is there and certainly could be used. And I guess the question is, well, if they misuse the technology, that's bad. So, I think and of course, like any technology, there are certain companies out there that you're willing to give information to because you're pretty confident they're not going to misuse it. And then there are companies out there, Facebook, that, you know, people give information to willingly and then they misuse it. And people continue to give them information willingly, even though they've been proven to misuse it. So it's kind of like, you know, there are some people that are very vocal about privacy invasions, but I think a lot of the public at large doesn't think too much about this. And so the other question is, you know, it's not like you're in a public space where they're doing this. You're on private property. You know, I mean, your option if you don't agree with facial recognition technology is to leave, right? Like Disney doesn't have to let you in. They are well within their rights to use facial recognition technology as long as they tell you ahead of time and you have the right to leave if you don't like it. They are certainly well within their legal rights to do it.
Yeah. Although somebody did point out in the chat, thank you, Jarrett, you know, going off of how well their systems work now, you know, MDX, Lilo, all of those, I'm sure the facial recognition will work perfectly. There will be no hiccups, no mistakes, no issues. It'll work flawlessly from day one.
Well, just like Magic Bands work flawlessly today. I mean, same thing.
That's what I'm saying. MDX, every time.
Handle it. Don't let Disney IT handle
it.
Right. Right. But so let's talk a bit about the whole, because this was brought up somewhere, and I don't know if it was brought up by Iger or not. This is also one thing I totally forgot about earlier. We were talking about executives. Why is Bob Chapek doing interviews on CNN when he's not the CEO
Iger?
of the company? Yes, sorry. Why isn't Bob Chapek doing on interviews? Why is Bob Iger doing it instead?
And Ashley Rant.
So we could talk about this, but I also want to mention this before I forget too. Wait, did I just forget what I was going to say? I think I did. No, it's not your fault. All right, go ahead, Ashley. Go on your rant while I try to figure out what I was going to say.
This is not so much a rant as it is a continuation of the conspiracy theory that I'm now going to float and keep floating. Where I truly, truly believe, and I referenced it earlier, that Iger is setting Chapek up to take the fall for all of this. Not that all of it is his fault. I mean, again, not blaming him for the pandemic. How things are being handled by the company, though, he is absolutely 100% going to take the fall for. The fact that he's not talking, he should absolutely, if nothing else, it should be a joint interview between the two of them as a passing of the baton. But it's very suspect to me that Iger is still the only spokesperson, the only person that we're hearing from, even though he stepped down as CEO, 3-4 months ago now? 5? Almost 5 months ago now. So I think when all is said and done, when the dust settles, they're going to push Chapek out saying, well, he was inept. He didn't know how to handle it. He panicked. And Iger had to step in and help him. He wasn't ready. We made a mistake, push him out of the way, and go back to the original succession plan that they had outlined a couple of months prior to happening. Chapek was not a part of that. And that's my conspiracy theory. I think he's being set up to be the fall guy so that they can push him out. And have somebody to take the blame
we can only hope.
Play the blame game.
We can only hope.
One of the.
I mean, he's making it very easy for them, but
he is. One of the analysts says you won't ever see Iger and Chapek next to each other talking in the same room, because every time Chapek starts to say something, you'll see Mr. Iger's mouth move. So it kind of destroys the whole ventriloquist effect, but. I have the same question. I mean, from the governance point of view of a public corporation, the reason that you have a chief executive officer is he the one that chiefly executes operations. I mean, he is the one who decides what to do, presents it to the board and the stakeholders or to whoever, depending on what it is, to gain consensus, and then goes ahead and executes that plan. The chairman of the board / creative specialist, executive, or whatever his other title is is supposed to be the idea guy, you know, the background, what do we do in 5 years guy, or at least that's how it was described.
It's also hilarious.
Described the new positions. Yeah, which is also hilarious for Mr. Iger. But it just seems, from the analyst point of view, extremely strange to have the CEO to be so quiet during a major disruption in the corporation's lifetime, really. And there's no explanation yet.
I think there actually is a very tactical reason for that. I think it's because Chapek is actually not that good. He's not a good talker. So, which I think calls into question his qualifications to be CEO of the company anyway.
Yeah.
Which feeds right into the conspiracy theory. There you go.
Right. Yeah, I think that feeds into Ashley's idea. So, you know, he has not shown himself to be capable of charming the media or anybody else for that matter. So, yeah, of course they're going to keep putting him out in front of people as long as the media keeps talking to him.
Yep, can't argue that. Cannot argue that.
Well, and the press, to their point, that's who they've gone to for the past 10 plus years now. It was what, 05? Right? 06 when Iger came in? Somewhere
04.
in there?
04.
Okay.
Disney and all that was 04.
Yeah.
I was
so, you know, that's who they've turned to for almost 20 years now. So I don't blame them. But if you really had all the faith and confidence that you claimed that you did when we did this whole shebang in the middle of a random Tuesday afternoon, that he's going to do great, he's got it, everything is fine, you would be pushing him out there to start doing more and more of these interviews. And it's very telling that he's not. That he's completely silent. You don't hear anything from him. Iger doesn't even reference him in his interviews, which I think is also comical and suspect. Like, these decisions and comments are still coming as if they're coming directly from Iger. Iger's still in charge. We're going to do this. We're looking at that. It's not, well, Chapek and I have talked, or Bob is thinking about doing this. He's not even acting like a spokesperson. He's still acting like the CEO.
He's acting like the
hilarious.
CEO. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like Bob and Silent Bob go to Disney or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wonder, somebody in the chat said this, maybe since Chapek is the budget cut guy that no one likes, and they realize that after the parks reopen, they're going to have to cut a lot of budgets until attendance comes back to normal, they put him in charge to cut the budgets after the parks reopen, and then when everybody gets pissed off that all these budgets are cut and there's like no service and poor customer service and bad food, then everybody gets mad at Chapek for cutting the budgets, because he clearly did that, because he was clearly in charge when that happened, and he's good at that. He likes cutting budgets. So it's not necessarily that they set him up to take the fall for the coronavirus closure and the poor performance of the company due to the coronavirus closure. It's that they knew budgets were going to have to get cut after the parks reopen. He's a guy that's known for doing that. Put him in there to do that, and then when everybody gets angry, he takes the fall for that.
Which feeds into
that's what I think.
Conspiracy theory, yeah.
I think that's exactly what they were going to do. I think Iger saw the writing on the wall. He wanted to protect his legacy as the guy who came in and saved Disney. So he got out. He's still with the company. So he can still schmooze and be the spokesperson. And I mean, again, I personally think he's acting like it. He's still technically the CEO. I'm sure Chapek is still going to him every other day. Bob, what do I do? And so I think he's still going to do all
Bob's
that, but
like,
he's setting Chapek up to be. But Chapek's being set up to be the bad guy, and he's going to get fired, and he's going to have his name dragged through the mud, somewhat.
But hey, if this is the best way to get Chapek out,
and I would agree with that.
If this is the best way to get Chapek out, then yeah.
If this is what it takes, but I mean, I'm surprised that he's not being smarter about all of this and at least fighting. It looks like he's just going right along with it and is going to skip down the yellow brick road to getting fired. So,
well, he may not have a choice, but $20 million parachute makes it a lot nicer of a landing.
Well, that's true.
So, I mean, in some ways you can feel bad for the guy, but I can't feel bad for the guy.
No, I don't necessarily feel bad for him. I mean, maybe if he had done anything worthwhile while being the park's CEO, I would feel differently. But everything that he takes credit for wasn't actually him. So there's that.
Yeah. I also think it's funny that Iger's on the board, and he's taken a role as like a creative director.
I was going to say, isn't it some weird...
He's the most uncreative CEO the company's ever had. So it's absolutely funny that he fancies himself the creative guy, and Chapek is like the leadership guy or whatever. I don't know. But anyway, that's just a little rant. And I totally didn't remember the other thing that I was going to say. It'll probably come to me in like half an hour.
Did it have anything to do
talking
with...
about budget...
I was going to say, does it have anything to do with the other thing that Iger is good at besides budget cuts, and that is increasing prices on stuff that doesn't deserve to be increased?
That's like a perfect sort of segue into the next topic on our list. How convenient. Yeah, no, that's where I was going, was that this is kind of a naturally leads into the food and beverage price increases that were put in place last week. You know, surprise, surprise, closed restaurants can still jack up their prices. And so we had seen a number of increases of food and beverage prices at restaurants in the parks and resorts. And is this just the first step of many increases, price increases, and then, of course, the budget cuts that we were just talking about that are coming once Walt Disney World reopens to try to get their revenue back to where it needs to be?
Yes. And I also think that because we know Disney is still living 15 years ago, they fully expected that they were going to be able to do this while it was closed and nobody would notice. Everybody would come back to the parks and say, ooh, that hot dog is $10. That's what I'll pay for it. Not realizing that there is a media spotlight, not just from us, but from other organizations that are going to be watching this. And yes, they're trying to raise prices because this is going to be their strategy that we're seeing already to raise that revenue to overcome the gap. So, I'm not surprised. I am disappointed. I think it's a completely ridiculous thing to do. I think if anything, you should freeze your prices right now and publicize that and say, hey, look, when we reopen, we want everybody to come back. We're freezing our prices. We're not going to go through our traditional, price increases that we do every year because we want people back in the parks and we want them to have a good time. But instead, they're, as usual, trying to sneak this through and hoping nobody notices.
It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's so ridiculous to me. And the pricing, we're not talking them going up $1 or $2. Like, some of the things are only $1 or $2, but drinks went up $4, $5. A cheeseburger went up to almost $20. I think it was Ale and Compass. So what? No, this is, and especially you're talking about a time to circle back to what we were talking about earlier. This is a point in time where you're not going to bank. I think they've been very blessed in the fact that people have had a lot of disposable income the past couple of years because the economy has overall done fairly well. And so they've been able to do these little incremental price hikes and nobody's really blinked at it because the economy is going right along with it. But you're going to be coming back to a point where you're going to be possibly begging people to come back to the resorts, and you're letting this news go out that while people 30% unemployment and we're going to charge $20 for a cheeseburger if and when you can come back to the parks. I think people are going to start hearing that, and you want to talk about things that are going to scare people away from coming back to the parks when it's safe. You're going to have the diehards like us, but we're not the ones that they clearly bank on. It's the people that come maybe once a year just for fun and aren't diehard Disney fans that pay attention to this kind of thing. But if this starts getting out, they're going to price them out very quickly. And so, you could jack the price for a cheeseburger up to $40. If nobody is willing to or can afford to pay that, that's not going to do you any good whatsoever.
Maybe this is how they're doing capacity control.
Well,
the virus is doing that for them and probably will.
One thing, sort of just to take, not necessarily devil's advocate point of view from this, but just an alternate possibility, is that, they're jacking up the food prices now while no one's there, and then they're gonna have, and I think they're gonna do this anyway, they're gonna have to drastically cut hotel prices and put out all kinds of promotions and offers to get people to come. Maybe this is how to mitigate the loss of revenue from those hotel promotions. Because if you get people that go that are saying, oh, well, I had a Disney trip planned and now the hotel's, $50 less a night, we could go, let's go now because it's cheap. And then they get dinged, $6 more for a burger. It's too late at that point for them to do anything about it. And so, they get lured in by the low hotel prices, and then they get taken with the food prices. Disney gets half of their money back that they gave out as the promotion for the hotel. So maybe these sort of subtle food price increases when people aren't there are the kind of thing that Disney's planning to make up the shortfall in revenue that they're going to have to give out as hotel promotions to get people to come. I mean, it's still your money either way, but I think the summary is that people don't look at food prices as much as they look at hotel and ticket prices. So,
but I also think
Disney
that
could
that's
certainly
changing.
Oh, I think it
that's
is,
very much
but still,
I mean,
for
you
the
look
vast
at sites
majority,
like Pinterest and stuff like that. I think even the people that just go casually are getting much savvier to the prices. I mean, you look at how much the media reports now when they do the annual park ticket increases versus what they used to report on 2 years ago. Like, people are starting to get wise to it, and the backlash is starting to come. And again, I think it goes back to the bigger picture. They're not offering something of value for that price anymore. And that's going to be the determining factor. Again, $20 for a cheeseburger is outrageous. I'm sorry. That's the most ridiculous thing.
$19.
No cheeseburger is worth... Okay, I'm sorry. $19 is entirely too much money to pay for any cheeseburger anywhere in the history of ever. That's why? They're pricing themselves out of the market. And
well, so here's the argument against that. Everyone makes this argument when they raise ticket prices, that they're pricing themselves out of the market. But I think if anybody knows the statistics, it's got to be Disney. They know when ticket prices are going to affect attendance. And apparently they haven't seen it yet, because they can still raise tickets and people can still come. So now if they're raising tickets and food, as David said, tongue-in-cheek somewhat, but I think it's true to some extent too, that this is just another effort to control capacity to the point at which people stop coming because of the price. Irrelevant of whether there's any value for that price, but the only way to make the parks less crowded is to get people to stop coming. And the easiest way to get people to stop coming is to raise ticket prices. So, in a sense, this is just one more step in the effort. And maybe these prices increases were planned months ago. I don't know. They could have been planned months ago, but it could still be just another step in the effort to lower the crowds that keep coming to Disney World regardless of how much the tickets cost.
And I would agree with that sentiment, but at the same token, they control and they set their capacity for the parks, whether, they build new attractions, they can add capacity, things like that. But, again, they can set that number. If people have been complaining for ages that the parks are too crowded. And we see them control the amount of people in a park on days like Christmas or New Year's. They could do that year round or things similar to that without necessarily having to raise ticket prices. They have other options. I see the argument for that, but I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree with it. I think the intent and the vision behind Disneyland and Disney World was something that all families could enjoy. And it's getting to the point now where a majority of families are getting to the point where it's going to be a very hard decision and a very trying thing to try to go to Disney, even just one time, for their entire family.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sad. It's very saddening to me. It's definitely very saddening to me that there are significant amounts of the kids in the world that are not going to be able to afford to come to Walt Disney World. Most of my life has been, decisions that I've made in my life have been based on the fact that I grew up going to Walt Disney World. So for kids to not have that is very saddening to me. At the same time, I've been saying this for months, that I would gladly pay twice as much for an annual pass if the parks were half as crowded. Because that's value to me. Honestly, a $1,000 annual pass where I still can only go on 3 rides a day because the standby lines are 3 hours, that's not a good value to me. But a $2,000 annual pass that I can go on all the rides I want with minimal wait, that's a much bigger value to me. That's why when I go to Disneyland, I happily pay the $10 or $15 or $20 for the max pass, because that's a huge value. And so I think it depends on where people see the value in the prices. Now, certain food obviously has a much better value than others, and that's why a hamburger at $19 has much lower value to Ashley than maybe it does to other people. I've had $20 hamburgers in New York City that were really good. I don't think Disney's is that good, but I'd pay $20 for a hamburger if it was the best hamburger I've ever had. And those have happened in New York City. But, is it when you're looking just at Disney, is a $20 hamburger the same value as, the full breakfast buffet at the Wave that's like $24 or whatever? That's a value question. Is a $20 hamburger a value when you can go off property? Heck, you could even go to the McDonald's that's on property and get 4 hamburgers for $20, and they're maybe just as well, maybe not at McDonald's, but you can get 4 hamburgers for $20 versus 1 at a place that's literally 3 miles down the road. So I think the value proposition that comes into play is sort of something that we could, it's a great discussion to have. I'd love to keep having this value proposition discussion, because something that's a value at one price point may not be a value at a different price point. But there's different ways that Disney can tip this value proposition in their favor, and certainly, raising the price of alcoholic beverages. Well, you can go to Publix and buy a couple cases of beer and drink it in your room instead of paying $20 for a drink at the Ale and Compass or whatever. But I mean, so the value proposition is different for different people, but still, I think whether this is just an effort to make up lost revenue or whether it's an effort to control crowds, or both to some extent, remains to be seen.
I think it was probably both. I mean, they've done regular interval increases, especially right before summer for the past couple of years, so it's not surprising. And again, I think my big issue and my sort of visceral reaction that this is dumb is, again, there's not, to the point earlier, there's not value to what they're charging for. Nothing's changing, nothing's improving. And they just seem, it seems to be that kind of like what we touched on last week. They're pushing the envelope just far enough to see what they can get away with, rather than saying, hey, we're adding this, we're doing this, so that justifies the price increase. We opened this new attraction this year. And I'm not saying they haven't opened new things, but again, it just, quality seems to be on the back burner, and they just seem, well, we need to raise prices this year for just because. And that's how it comes across. And that to me is not okay. Get me a working monorail. How hard is that? Why If you were telling me that the $20 hamburger and the $20 old fashioned that used to cost me $14 and now is, again, I think it raises up to like $19, almost $20, because that was the other one. I love the old fashions at Brown Derby, and they went up $5 or $6. If you were telling me that all that extra money was going towards a new monorail, I would pay it every day, any day. But I don't see any of that. I don't see it being reinvested in the parks, and that's what I have a problem with.
Well, that's exactly right, because we talked about this last week, where much of the park's profit is getting funneled into other less profitable divisions of the company, and that's been a problem for years now, and that's why JPEG continues to cut things at the parks, and the profits from the parks don't at all go back into the parks.
But again, that's the problem. You're raising prices, but cutting the entertainment. Again, you're raising prices on everything. For instance, around World Showcase. I know that I don't think they were included in our story and it hasn't come out yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if those drinks go up too. But you cut all the entertainment that draws me to hang out and stay and have a drink in World Showcase. So what kind of logic is that? It's dumb. Again, they don't care. They don't care about the actual experience. They just care about getting their hands on your money.
And as long as we're speculating and to the company as a whole too, it was definitely true that the parks and resorts funneled money into the rest of the company. We've had some really, really big successes in the movie parts, but not so great in ESPN, for example. And certainly for the total bottom line and for the total cash flow, parks and resorts was kind of a shining light for the past few years. It's probable that it won't be for the next couple of years for all the reasons that we've been talking about. So what happens when things are radically different from how they used to be? On the one end of the spectrum, like I think Jason mentioned early, there'll be people chomping at the bit to get to Disney, and they can't keep up with the number of people that want to come back, and they have to limit things and everything else. But the value proposition, I think part of the value proposition, which is off kilter because of the pricing, yes, I agree with that. But there's some intangibles too. Disney has always been marketed as a safe comfort zone where you don't necessarily have to worry about the outside world. And if people start seeing that cast members are wearing masks and a lot of the guests are wearing masks, and you have to do a temperature check before you get in, and you have to stay outside of Casey's, and you can only go in when the next available cast member is ready to give you your hot dog, and I don't know what else. You have to have only one person in the Emporium checkout line at a time and that sort of thing. Constant reminders that there's a disease out there that wants to kill you. Will that be part of the value proposition, and how does Disney combat that? Because now they no longer can be that safe place and all. So
it ruins the escapism.
They have to drop?
Yeah.
It ruins the escapism.
I mean,
and I think they'll have to entice people to come in, and raising prices doesn't really entice people to come in. So they might be tweaking one part of the value, but they're not tweaking the other part of the value, and they're going to come up with a negative sum instead of a zero or positive sum in the whole game.
I want to say, I don't know nowadays whether people put as big of a value on that escapism as they used to, and as Disney used to market it that way. I don't know that they market it that way as much, and I don't know that people really expect that as much as they used to. I think when bag checks and metal detectors came into use, that's sort of went out the window. But the other thing I want to talk about is what you said with what happens when the cash cow of the company, the Parks and Resorts division, isn't the cash cow anymore. I mean, certainly the movie studios aren't going to be making a lot of money either with all these movie theaters being closed. And, is streaming going to pick up that slack? Well, I don't know. I think we're going to talk about that a lot next week. Disney Plus and the direct-to-streaming release of movies and how that affects the profit of movies. But so stay tuned for that for next week, because we're actually really running close to our 2-hour point at this point. But is there going to be a cash cow part of the company that can funnel money into the parks? I don't think so. Certainly not this year. And so the question is, if the parks can't funnel money into poor performing divisions because the parks are one of those poor performing divisions, the whole rest of the company's in deep trouble too.
Right, and that was part of the point is, and maybe the feel good intangible isn't really what I meant, but I think there is still an element of escapism, or at least the entitlement to escapism, let's say, where we definitely know that people at Disney tend to drop things and drop behaviors that they would employ normally in the real world because they're at Disney and it's someplace special and they spent $1,000 and several $1,000, and so their needs possibly come first. What is all of this stuff with having to wait outside and it's more complicated and now I have to submit to a health check and so on, and so it's going to be a factor that just adds to the increasing threshold of what it takes to get into Disney. It starts at the airport if you're flying in, and then it continues at your resort, and then it continues at each of the parks. And it's not just security and walking through a metal detector, it's having your temperature taken, and who knows what else will happen with that. But it's just, I'm concerned that one possible outcome is that it takes a very long time for attendance at the parks to ramp up, and during that time we're going to see a lot of volatility in all of the pricing and the deals and the availability of rides and rooms at Disney, and it's likely going to be like it has been during coronavirus for other places that are open. We change our hours, and this week hours aren't like next week's hours, and then the week after that is going to change again, and it's going to be much more complicated to go to Disney, I think. And that I think will reduce the number of people that really want to go.
Yeah, I think that's very valid. I think things will certainly be sort of variable for the next probably year until things sort of settle down and people figure out, what they're comfortable doing, what they can afford to do. It's probably, for those people that can go to the parks and are willing to take the risk of going to the parks, certainly there's not going to be crowds there. We're rapidly closing in on our 2-hour mark. I want to give a shout out to Mike in the chat who gave us a super chat for $4.99. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you. That means a lot. And let's do like a last minute wrap up where we can go around and everybody gets like another 2 minutes to sort of close out with anything else that they didn't get a chance to say. And we'll end with me and we'll call it a night. Go ahead, David, why don't you start?
All right. I don't have a whole lot left. It's going to be interesting the next couple of weeks just to see how much pressure there is to reopen and, how much they bend to that. And then I'm very curious to see how they reopen and what measures they put in place. I think that, we can speculate all we want about that, but till we get there, it's going to be difficult to know exactly what they do. But I do think that, like you said, Jason, the variability is going to go up and down tremendously over the next year. And I think we're going to see, at least for the next 2 years, the return of the low seasons, the time of year when you could go and it was almost empty. But I do think that, you're probably right. What you said, much earlier in the show that, Christmas time will probably be as packed as it always is. But January, it's anybody's guess if we're even open by then. And I hope we are.
Rich, any last thoughts?
Next. Sure. I went to Disney World in February of 2002 and Disneyland in January of 2002, which was only a few months after 9/11. And I would describe the mood even then as very somber, but very uncrowded as well. So it was good and yet it was bad. Yeah. And that was a somewhat one-time controlled thing as far as we know. Airplanes would not be falling out of the sky every day. This is slightly different in that the virus exists to kill you, and we don't really know how to control it yet. And things like in places like Disney are anathema to the control of the virus. And so what do? Like David said, it's fun to speculate, but we won't know what we don't know until it actually happens. And we won't know that until every week goes by. I mean, whether it opens in June, July, August, who knows when. It will be very interesting to watch and follow.
Ashley?
I feel like I talked a lot, but I will take a moment just to plug the nighttime show contest that we are running. I believe it's for News Tonight this coming week is when they're going to debut it. Yeah, but full details are on the website. If you want to search there, similar to the pre-show contest that was run, we all know
Make your own nighttime spectacular.
Yeah. So wishes, rivers of light, happily ever after, what have you. But again, full details are on the site, but we're really excited. We had a lot of great participation for the pre-show. Everybody did a fantastic job, and you all are incredibly creative, so we'd love to see what you could do with a nighttime show.
Yep, so yeah, as Ashley said, the contest is for create your own nighttime spectacular at home. The prize will be core bucks, just like it was for the Make It Home pre-shows. That we had some great submissions for that one. So check out WDWNT.com for the rules, or email us if you have questions. Also continue to tune in to WDWNT all this week. We have 2 live shows every day, one in the morning, 11 a.m. or noon Eastern, and then again at night, 8 or 9 Eastern, every day while the parks are closed for you guys to tune in and get your little fix of Disney until the parks can reopen. So check out all the offerings at WDWNT.com and on our YouTube channel, Facebook. We're streaming everywhere. Let us know if there's something you think we should talk about on this show. Let us know. Happy to take feedback. And next week, apologies to the first those who thought the first 2 weeks of this were somewhat depressing, but that's the situation that we're in. Next week, on the agenda is Disney Plus. And direct to streaming movie releases and what that means for the company, what that means for the industry. And then also we're going to talk a couple other things, speculating what's going to happen. Anybody who wants to email us, you can email me at jason@wdwnt.com, or if you have super good positive things to say, send them to tom@wdwnt.com and let him know that we're doing a really good job here on Sunday nights and that you're really enjoying it. Also, if you want to support us ongoing, you can check out our WIGS program at patreon.com/WDWNT. Our WIGS gets special perks. If you've been reading the site and you've been seeing some of the old paper materials that we've been digging up and scanning in, I put up the 1964 Walt Disney Productions annual report. I've got the 1973 annual report scanned in. We put up the Disney's America brochure, a lot of cool stuff. And I keep scanning more things in that I keep finding. So WIGS members get access to all of that in high-resolution downloadable PDF formats. So that for as little as $2 a month, you get post shows after WDW News Tonight, and all kinds of great perks. So check that out. And we just got a super chat from Amina for $20. So thank you so much. That's fantastic. Thanks again. And tune in next week, everybody. Hopefully things are not quite as depressing. And if we can stay away from the coronavirus talk for a week, we're going to give it a shot and try. or at least we'll see, depending on what happens. Maybe there's something else that happens this week that needs our attention. But pressing issues, we're going to talk about pressing issues, whatever happens. If it's important for the Walt Disney Company and the Disney parks, we're going to talk about it on the show. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Night, everyone.
Bye.